recently seen major changes in the status quo of control. When the Chinese took the paracels, that was a big change. But beyond that, it's been fairly stable. There have been little skirmishes, they've built the occasional structure on district reach and so on. But only in the last several months are there things that look potentially really change the control. One is the net across the mouth of Scarborough Reef on the island, which really makes that a PRC control area. And another is what may turn out to be a shift in effective control of the area around the Senkaku-Diaoyu Pact, with China insisting that Japan needs to understand the world has changed. Those are status quo undertakings, and I think in those circumstances, finding some way of changing the subject from pushing on the sovereignty issue is particularly important. And whether it's President Ma's East China Sea Peace Initiative or some other way of getting out of this game, which now seems to be played in a way that can change status quos, is important. I just want to say a couple other things on this, and then get to our last question before we turn to the audience. I would say that, that one of the interesting things about the East China Sea Peace Initiative and the proposal that it might be extended to the South China Sea context is that I would say this serves Taiwan's interests, especially Taiwan's interests with the United States, in one important way. There had been a tendency in not just the popular accounts, but I think even in serious thinking about these issues, to say repeatedly that the ROC claims and the PRC claims are essentially the same. That is, there's not much daylight between Beijing and Taipei on how to handle these things. I think we're starting to see some of that daylight. And I think, although the claims of sovereignty look rather similar if you draw the maps, what you've got is a PRC position which seems increasingly to challenge the status quo of current control in some areas. And that this says, yes, set aside, let's talk about cooperation. But the ROC position has taken more of the emphasis on cooperation, joint development, which used to be more central to the PRC approach. Think the agreement with Japan about the Chinchou field, which fell apart. So there may be an emerging gap there, which I think helps differentiate the ROC position from the PRC position in a way that helps with Taiwan's external relations and relations with the US. But it does, of course, come in the context of other steps that have caused some friction. For instance, the US, I think, would have been happier had the ROC not taken what is still a fairly PRC-like position on what the government of Japan did toward the nationalization of to keep Ishihara from taking it. So it's a complicated pattern, but I think on the whole, the East China Sea Peace Initiative creates some useful daylight between PRC and ROC positions on that. As to the fisheries agreement more narrowly, I think that's a remarkable coup. As Jude says, not only anything that comes after so many years of failed attempts is worthy of notice, but it's not just an important taking down of tension in an area of friction. It is not just a diplomatic accomplishment. I would say it has two other features, or at least one other feature to it, which is it's really a coup on status. That is, Taiwan has entered into an agreement with Japan that is the kind of agreement that states enter into with states. And that's part of why the PRC is so ticked off about it. And then the next step in President Ma's scenario is you have a series of the three bilaterals which then lead to a trilateral. That is a real assertion not only of Taiwan's interests, but of Taiwan's status as an equal party in this kind of negotiation. And that's big game he's hunting for there. It's a constant challenge that Taiwan faces. And I think he made a remarkable step forward, really thanks to the deterioration of Sino-Japanese relations as well as Taiwanese diplomatic skill in this area. And I would say that President Ma, the well-educated international lawyer, was very clever in this by stressing the analogy to the North Sea continental shelf cases and saying those went to the International Court of Justice, which only didn't resolve them, but the parties with claims all wound up as co-equal parties before the ICJ. Then they went away and negotiated an amicable solution where everybody benefited from resource exploitation. So that I think is an impressive set of maneuverings there, and it explains why some people are feeling that they're oxen are forward, particularly in Beijing on this. Any other thoughts on this topic? And if not, then I'll raise one last one and then throw it open to our audience.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to say that the PRC's most credible claim to the islands hinges on Taiwan's claim to the islands. And it's this, and that is they maintain that the Diaoyu/Senkaku were ruled as part of Taiwan when the Japanese owned Taiwan. And therefore, when Japan repudiated ownership of Taiwan. It simultaneously repudiated the Diaoyu. You see what I mean? However, Taiwan has been unable to come up with a piece of paper proving it did. And the Chinese have, I'm going to try to find a neutral word, have stated that such a paper existed and that there was a lawsuit sometime in the 1930s because Okinawa also claimed jurisdiction, plus Taiwan. But nobody can find the piece of paper. Now, this could be because the Japanese shredded it as soon as they found it, or it could be that it was destroyed. There was extensive bombing in the area and that sort of thing, so nobody knows. But Okinawa has a couple of pieces of paper. Taiwan has yet to prove that. But in any case, I think your point is excellent, that this has created some daylight between the PRC's claim and Taiwan's claim at this point, and it does not, and which does not help China at all, because in fact it works against China's claim, because if Taiwan is no longer harping on its jurisdiction, then the PRC's claim there falls apart.
And I think in some sense, President Ma's approach places a greater emphasis on these non-sovereignty issues, so that's going up. At the same time, the PRC has placed greater emphasis on the sovereignty issues relatively set aside and find ways of cooperating. All right, just one last point of this same thread, and then I'll throw it open to questions from the audience. Another theme which we've just been talking about now, which I think is also important in President Ma's address, is this question of Taiwan's international status and the stature that comes with it as a basis for security. So there's a lot about things like joining the government procurement agreement in the WTO, the status of WHA in pursuit of ICAO, and the UN framework on climate change type arrangements. Those are familiar. We have a couple of new installments like attending the Vatican installation ceremony, and this, I think these quasi-consulates actually may be a step in the same direction. I know the DPP criticism has been that this is going to become sort of like the Xinhua office in Hong Kong, an instrument for asserting central government control, but to the extent they are consulate-like, it's again a pursuit of a degree of equality. President Ma insisted on being called President Ma if there was the meeting. So there are all these familiar elements, plus again the more recent developments such as the Japan Fisheries Agreement, the visa waiver program, all these things which amount to Taiwan being treated as and behaving as a full-fledged state-type member of the international community, which has always been, along with the values issues, democracy, human rights, and rule of law, a particularly important basis of strength and stature, not only for close U.S.-Taiwan relations, but for a degree of standing in the international community that an entity of Taiwan's size and because of PRC views, at least, disputed stature in the international system. But just close with that and throw it open to our questions. There's a microphone circulating. Please pose your question. And if you want to address it to a particular member or members of the panel.
Well, not a question as much as a comment. In a sense, when I look at Taiwan, I look at your sphere, i.e. government to government, if you will, and what is my sphere and the sphere of a variety of people in religious studies and anthropology, etc. And that is the people to people, and economics, the people to people sphere. And when we look at Taiwan and the PRC, I think there's a different way of looking at it. And here I'm going to be pushing a book that Doug Fuller and I have recently put together and will be out from Rutledge on U.S. to Taiwan to PRC high-tech interaction and relationship, if you will. And what comes out of that and what comes out of other things is I guess I see Taiwan more and more, number one, like the United States in the 60s, getting rid of its messy industries for reasons of high labor cost and reasons of pollution, and sending them away. And of course they send them to various parts of China. And there's an enormous investment since the mid-90s of particularly the high-tech industry. A lot of the production is done throughout China. I was at 2010, I was at high-tech fair in the new center in Nangang, and every company I came across, the R&D is in Hsinchu, and the product is produced various places in China, primarily Suzhou, Shanghai corridor. I think that represents another level of interaction that's going on. The other level of interaction is the amount of direct trade that goes on between, and economic relations between Taiwan and PRC. I mean, it's a lot closer. And in an odd way, instead of mutually assured destruction, which may or may not have been the reality had Taiwan gotten the bomb, and we now know, of course, that the United States did not let them have their own atomic weapons. This was laid out. There's a young man finishing graduate a PhD at Brandeis who's kind of made a very strong argument, has lots of good data on Korea and Taiwan, why the United States did not let them have the bomb, the atomic bomb, or atomic counter capabilities.
Taiwan should have a nuclear bomb.
This was an argument that Taiwan raised in the 1960s, 70s, and into the 80s. They were still pursuing it in a variety of ways, but the United States simply put a lid on all of that very neatly. But there's also the other relationship, and increasingly Taiwan seems to be looking at the PRC in terms of human relationships. The fact that 1.5 million Taiwanese are living in Shanghai Suzhou corridor. What does that mean in terms of that relationship and the threat of that relationship? They're getting closer in that way. And the other example comes out of Ma Ying-jeou's policy of having direct flights, pushing for developing this negotiation from 2008 to by 2010. It was a reality that some of us take full advantage of. And that in turn is another kind of relationship the other way, that if you, and this goes back to about a year ago now, I was at the first National Congress, International Congress of Taiwan Studies, and then did some speaking, and one day I got to Palace Museum. Who was there? Mainlanders. Lots and lots and lots of mainlanders on a slow Monday. The next day, I was at Taipei 101 doing something with the Columbia Alumni Association, and the head of that association is the manager of Taipei 101. I go to the top and I look at Taipei below me, and who's around me? PRC people, tourists. Okay. And the other little detail that now the PRC can buy into 10%, I believe, at this moment, of Taiwanese corporations, something that they weren't allowed to do before. I think what I'm saying here is the level of integration is much greater than it seems if we look, and if we look a little deeper, we see that level of integration, and I just wanted to point that out.
Okay, thanks. I'll take another question and then go ahead to the panelists. Go ahead. Since we're running a little short time, why don't we take 2 questions and I'll invite the panelists to respond to everyone. Yeah. And then back to that.
This question is directed to the entire panel. I guess my question is, through Taiwan and China relations, if you look, and Professor Wolf alluded to the fact that he can't really predict what's going to happen in the future because there's not much historical context to base it on. But if we look to, say, America, in our history of development, China can seem to be going through a similar pattern of development, and ultimately they're going to have to democratize in some form to ensure domestic stability, which could help relations with them in Taiwan. And ultimately, from a pattern you see is stable borders between countries and territories are either obtained through war or purchase. You can see Israel and Palestine have confrontations through, and that their borders were done through diplomatic process. So don't you see, to get this issue resolved, either someone's going to purchase the land or there's going to be a war over it, if you look through historical data.
Okay, and the gentleman in the cap in the back, and then we'll get the panel to respond. We'll take another round of questions then.
You're talking here very much, and you, Mr. Chairman, and you, businessmen, about democracy, something. And no such things exist. Prime Minister of England said one day, Britain don't have friends or enemy. They have businesses only, okay? And we have the best example. North Korea is absolutely different treated by, how you say, People China Republic. Yeah? Of course, because I live it in this system and I live it in capitalism, I know all system from personal experience. I know that Taiwan will not defend by US. Even I don't believe that in Europe, the Atlantic Pact, US will defend nobody against Russia. I am sure in 100% almost. Only in business will be. And my question is, what is this treaty between now Taiwan and Japan? I think this is the most important. Of course, as we see North and South Korea as a polygon to next maybe nuclear war, there will be limited maybe nuclear missile exchange, because it's in business of continental China and business of US. But with Taiwan, it's a different situation, yeah? And of course, you can deal very good with communists, because I am from country, we invited in 1977 Taiwanese computer industry to communist country. And we deal with them. This is, of course, about, I'm talking about Poland. And now, situation for Taiwan is worse and worse political, because Korea is the most important. You have a treaty between Taiwan and Japanese, and what was in the shredder, what kind of document? Can you tell us, Madame, what was this treaty?
Thanks for your question. Let me turn it over to the panelists. We have on the table the question of social and economic integration and how that weighs against the political. The questions of political transformation of the mainland and the possibility of a diplomatic or cash-based element to the borders, and then this question of Taiwan's external relations with Japan. So the last question was specific to
Japan, and what was in the shredder?
I didn't understand that question, but let me, I simply did not understand your question. But in any case, I don't really share the optimism of the previous speaker that said, democracy must happen. I don't think democracy is inevitable. And I also think, Professor Shum, that when Xi Jinping talks about democracy, he doesn't understand the same thing by the word democracy that most Westerners do. And what we have seen happening in China is a state-sponsored and state-supported capitalism in which the capitalists are very dependent on state support for their continued prosperity. Chinese businessmen are not demanding democracy.
Sorry, in time of war is no any democracy. From democratic country is a war. Okay, war is not democratic.
The other comment that the questioner said is that either war or purchase solves border disputes. Was a very famous international lawyer named Quincy Wright, who did a lengthy study of border disputes and came to the conclusion that almost all of them are solved by becoming obsolete along the line of actual control. In other words, neither side cedes anything formally, and there is no purchase and there is no war. We're waiting an awfully long time for settlement in many of them, Kashmir, for example, but you do see a rough line of control happening there, and there's occasional skirmishes. That's the kind of thing he had in mind. So I don't think democracy is inevitable. I think it is perfectly possible, as you have in Singapore, to have a, I don't know, what do you call it, a prosperous autocracy? Also that one need not expect that the alternatives are to border disputes or purchase or conquest.
I don't see any specific question that I should respond to, but Let me add 2 points. I think especially one point, I think President Ma is too modest. He didn't mention something that he accomplished, which made everything possible, which is the diplomatic truce. When he came to power, the first thing he did was to suggest to the other side, and this was accepted, that each side should stop its diplomatic war, raiding each other for diplomatic recognition. And that made everything else possible. The Santong and the ECFA and everything. And I think he was being too modest. I think we should give that much credit to him. I think that will hold the key to understanding other issues.
Yeah, that's right. That certainly should have been on my list of things that have helped secure and has Taiwan's independence. Bush?
I just have a brief comment on the East China Sea issues. That the Louisiana Purchase really frightens China. The concept of, I don't think that's a silver bullet